7 albino foals materialized in the desert heat and stalked Jack Mallory for 3 days, their unnatural eyes tracking his every movement like they were leading him to something he couldn't survive. When sunrise came and the horses began dissolving into pure light, revealing the murdered souls trapped inside them, Jack understood he had been following death itself toward a reckoning 7 years in the making. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Jack Mallory had been riding through the Sonoran Desert for 3 days when he first heard the sound that would change everything. It was a soft nickering, barely audible over the whisper of wind through the saguaro cacti and the rhythmic clop of his sorrel mare's hooves on the sun-baked earth. He pulled back on the reins, his weathered hand steady, despite the tremor of uncertainty that ran through him. The mare, a dependable creature named Copper who had carried him across half of Arizona territory, stopped immediately, her ears swiveling backward as if she too sensed something unusual in the vast emptiness surrounding them. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a brutal landscape of sand and stone that had claimed more lives than Jack cared to count in his 42 years. Towering saguaros stood like silent sentinels, their arms raised to the merciless sky as if in permanent surrender to the elements. Ocotillo branches reached out like skeletal fingers, and patches of prickly pear dotted the copper-colored earth like clusters of green armor. It was beautiful in its harshness, this land that demanded respect and gave nothing freely to those who underestimated it. Jack had been born to this desert, raised on a small ranch 20 miles south of Tucson before drought and disease had taken everything his family owned. His father had died trying to save their herd during the terrible summer of 1873, collapsing in the very pasture he had fought so hard to maintain. His mother had followed 6 months later, grief stealing what the desert had not. At 19, Jack had sold what little remained and struck out on his own, becoming the kind of man the frontier seemed to produce in abundance, solitary, self-reliant, shaped by loss into something harder than the stone beneath his feet. Before we continue Jack's journey, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying this story, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've got something extraordinary waiting for you. The nickering came again, closer this time, and Jack's hand moved instinctively to the rifle secured to his saddle. He had learned long ago that unexpected sounds in the desert rarely meant anything good. It could be rustlers, Apache raiders, or any number of desperate men who saw a lone rider as an opportunity rather than a person. But as he scanned the shimmering horizon, what he saw made him question whether the desert sun had finally driven him mad. 7 foals emerged from behind a cluster of beryl cacti, their coats so white they seemed to glow against the rust-colored landscape. Not the cream or gray that horses sometimes carried, but pure, unblemished white, the kind Jack had only seen once before in his life on an albino colt that had died within days of birth. Too fragile for the harsh realities of frontier life. These foals were different, though, moving with surprising vigor despite the heat that turned the afternoon air into something that could be felt rather than merely breathed. Their eyes, instead of the pale blue or pink that usually marked albino animals, were dark and intelligent. Watching him with an awareness that seemed almost human, Jack sat perfectly still in his saddle, his mind working through the impossibility of what he was seeing. 7 albino foals, alone in the desert without their mothers, without any sign of the herd they must have come from. The odds of one albino birth were rare enough, but 7, and all of them healthy enough to be wandering the Sonoran on their own. It defied everything he knew about horses, about nature, about the brutal mathematics of survival in this unforgiving land. Copper shifted nervously beneath him, sensing his confusion and perhaps feeling her own. Horses were prey animals, always alert to danger, and there was something about these ghostly foals that set every instinct on edge. Yet they showed no fear, no wariness of the strange horse and rider watching them. Instead, they moved closer, their small hooves making soft sounds in the sand, their white manes catching the sunlight like spun silver. The lead foal, slightly larger than the others, stopped about 10 feet from Copper and regarded Jack with eyes that held depths he could not fathom. It was a filly he could see now, well-formed despite her youth, with legs that promised speed and a chest that spoke of endurance. Behind her, the other 6 arranged themselves in a semicircle, 3 on each side, their positioning so deliberate it seemed almost military in its precision. Jack had spent enough time around horses to recognize intelligence when he saw it, but this was something different. These foals were communicating with each other. He was certain of it, passing information in ways he could not detect, but could sense in the subtle shifts of their bodies, the flick of ears, the way they seemed to move as one organism rather than 7 separate creatures. He should ride away. Every practical bone in his body told him that these animals represented trouble of a kind he could not predict. Strange things happened in the desert, and men who investigated mysteries often found answers they wished they had never discovered. But Jack Mallory had been alone for so long that the appearance of anything unusual in his solitary existence carried a pull stronger than caution. Besides, they were just horses, young ones at that, and he could not in good conscience leave them to die in the desert, no matter how peculiar their presence might be. Slowly, he dismounted, keeping his movements calm and measured. The foals watched but did not retreat. He pulled his canteen from the saddle and poured water into his hat, the precious liquid catching the sunlight as it splashed against the sweat-stained felt. He had 2 days' worth of water left, maybe 3 if he rationed carefully, and sharing it with 7 foals would cut that margin dangerously thin. But the desert had taught him that sometimes survival meant making choices that defied logic, trusting instinct over calculation. The lead filly approached first, her muzzle dipping to the water with delicate precision. The others followed, forming an orderly line that would have impressed any cavalry officer. They drank sparingly, as if aware of the sacrifice he was making, and when they finished, they did not scatter or wander. Instead, they turned as one and began walking in the direction Jack had been heading, toward the distant mountains where he hoped to find the ranch he had been hired to work. Jack remounted Copper, his mind still trying to make sense of what he was witnessing. The foals maintained their formation, walking with purpose rather than the aimless wandering typical of young horses separated from their herd. They moved southeast, precisely the direction he had been traveling for the past 3 days, and that coincidence troubled him more than he wanted to admit. He had learned in his years on the frontier that coincidences were often anything but, that patterns existed beneath the surface of random events for those willing to see them. The afternoon sun beat down with relentless intensity, turning his shirt into a second skin of sweat and dust. He pulled his hat lower, shading eyes already narrowed against the glare that bounced off every surface, until the whole world seemed made of light and heat. Copper plodded forward steadily, her breathing regular despite the temperature, and the 7 white foals kept pace just ahead, never falling behind, never pulling too far forward. It was as if they knew exactly how fast the mare could travel comfortably and adjusted their speed accordingly. Jack had been hired by a rancher named Samuel Brennan to help drive cattle from a remote property in the Tortolita Mountains to market in Tucson. The pay was good, better than he usually commanded, which should have been his first warning that something about the job was not quite right. Brennan had been vague about the details, speaking only of a herd that needed moving and a ranch that had been in his family for 30 years. When Jack had pressed for specifics, the older man had waved away his questions with assurances that everything would be clear once he arrived. Now, 3 days into what should have been a 4-day journey, Jack found himself following 7 impossible horses deeper into the desert, his destination still a full day's ride ahead, according to the crude map Brennan had sketched on the back of an envelope. The foals showed no signs of fatigue despite the heat and the rough terrain. If anything, they seemed to gain energy as the sun climbed higher, their white coats remaining somehow pristine despite the dust that coated everything else in sight. By his calculation, it was late September, that treacherous time of year when the desert could swing from scorching days to freezing nights with no warning. He would need to make camp soon, find shelter among the rocks where he could build a small fire and ward off the cold that would come with darkness. The foals would need protection too, though from what he could not say. They seemed remarkably self-sufficient for creatures so young, but the desert at night belonged to predators, and even the strongest animals could fall victim to a hungry mountain lion or pack of coyotes. The land began to change as they traveled, the flat expanses giving way to rolling hills, dotted with more vegetation. Mesquite trees appeared, their twisted branches offering patches of shade, and creosote bushes filled the air with their distinctive scent, sharp and clean like the desert itself. Jack recognized this terrain from the map Brennan had provided. They were entering the foothills of the Tortolitas, which meant the ranch should be less than 20 miles ahead. The lead filly stopped suddenly, her head raised and ears pricked forward. The other 6 foals froze in perfect synchronization, their bodies tense with alert awareness. Jack's hand went to his rifle again, every sense straining to detect whatever had alarmed them. At first, he heard nothing but the wind and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Then it came, faint but unmistakable, the sound of gunfire echoing off the rocky hills ahead. 3 shots in quick succession, then silence, then 3 more. It was a pattern, deliberate and controlled, nothing like the chaos of a gunfight or the random shooting of hunters. Someone was signaling, but to whom and for what purpose, Jack could not guess. The foals remained motionless, and he found himself waiting for them to move, trusting their instincts more than his own knowledge of the territory. When they finally resumed walking, they had altered their course, angling away from the direct route toward the ranch, and heading instead toward a cluster of rock formations that rose like broken teeth from the desert floor. Jack followed, no longer questioning the wisdom of letting horses guide his path. Whatever these creatures were, wherever they had come from, they knew something he did not, and his survival might depend on respecting that knowledge. The rock formations grew larger as they approached, revealing themselves to be the entrance to a narrow canyon cut deep into the hillside. The walls rose 50 feet on either side, close enough that Jack could have touched both sides if he stretched out his arms. The foals entered without hesitation, their hoofbeats echoing off the stone in a rhythm that sounded almost musical. Copper balked initially, her instincts warning against entering such a confined space, but Jack urged her forward with gentle pressure from his knees. Inside the canyon, the temperature dropped noticeably, the high walls blocking the direct sunlight and creating a corridor of relative coolness. Jack could see scratches on the rock face, marks left by flash floods during the monsoon season, and he made a mental note to keep an eye on the sky. Getting caught in this narrow space during a storm would mean certain death, the water rising faster than any horse could run. The canyon twisted and turned, never following a straight path for more than 20 yards. The foals navigated each bend with confidence, never hesitating at intersections where smaller passages branched off into darkness. They knew this place, Jack realized, had traveled through it before, and that revelation raised new questions about their origins. These were not wild horses stumbling through unfamiliar territory. They were going somewhere specific, with purpose and knowledge, and they wanted him to follow. After what felt like an hour but was probably closer to 20 minutes, the canyon opened into a hidden valley, a natural amphitheater surrounded by cliffs on 3 sides. A spring bubbled up from the rocks at the far end, feeding a small pool of crystal-clear water before disappearing underground again. Grass grew in thick patches around the pool, and several cottonwood trees provided shade, their leaves rustling in a breeze that seemed to exist only in this sheltered place. Jack dismounted slowly, his legs stiff from hours in the saddle, and led Copper toward the spring. The 7 foals had already reached the water, drinking deeply this time, their thirst no longer constrained by the need to conserve a stranger's canteen. He watched them carefully, looking for any sign of illness or weakness that might explain their unusual appearance. But they seemed perfectly healthy, their movements fluid and strong despite their youth. The valley was perhaps 2 acres in size, ringed by cliffs that would make it nearly impossible to find unless you knew the canyon entrance. It was the kind of place outlaws favored, a natural fortress where a few men could hold off a small army. And Jack found himself wondering if that was why the foals had brought him here. Perhaps this was not sanctuary but trap, and he had been foolish enough to follow ghostly horses into an ambush. His hand rested on his revolver as he scanned the cliff tops, searching for the glint of rifle barrels or the silhouette of watching men. Nothing moved except the cottonwood leaves and a pair of ravens circling overhead, their harsh cries echoing off the stone walls. If this was a trap, it was an elaborate one, and Jack could not fathom what purpose it would serve. He had nothing worth stealing except Copper and his weapons, and there were easier targets on the main roads for men looking to rob travelers. The foals finished drinking and moved to the grass, grazing with the single-minded focus of young animals whose primary concern was filling their bellies. Jack led Copper to the spring and let her drink while he refilled his canteen, the water so cold and pure it made his teeth ache. He splashed some on his face, washing away 3 days of accumulated dust and sweat, and felt almost human again, for the first time since leaving Tucson. As he straightened, movement caught his eye near the base of the far cliff. One of the foals, the smallest of the 7, had wandered away from the others and was pawing at something half buried in the sand. Jack walked over, curiosity overcoming his natural caution, and saw what had attracted the young horse's attention. It was a saddle, or what remained of one, the leather cracked and bleached by exposure to sun and weather. The stirrups were still attached, though the metal had oxidized to a deep rust, and when Jack lifted it, he found the maker's mark still visible on the underside. Brennan Saddlery, Tucson, Arizona Territory. Established 1851, the same surname as the man who had hired him. Jack turned the saddle over in his hands, examining it with the practiced eye of someone who had repaired enough tack to recognize quality work. This had been an expensive piece, custom-made with silver conchos and intricate tooling that must have taken weeks to complete. It was the kind of saddle a wealthy rancher might commission, something meant to last generations rather than years. Yet here, it lay abandoned in a hidden valley, destroyed by time and elements. The small foal nickered softly and moved to another spot, pawing again with deliberate intent. Jack followed and found more artifacts scattered across the valley floor, half-buried treasures revealed by the persistent digging of small hooves, a bridle with silver buckles, a pair of spurs inlaid with turquoise, a leather belt with a buckle shaped like a longhorn steer, and most disturbing of all, a human skull, bleached white by the sun, its empty eye sockets staring up at the merciless sky. Jack stepped back involuntarily, his heart hammering in his chest. This was no simple campsite abandoned by passing travelers. This was a grave, or perhaps multiple graves, and the foals had brought him here to find it. He looked at the 7 white horses with new understanding, seeing them now not as lost animals, but as guides, as messengers delivering a truth that someone had tried to bury in this forgotten place. The lead filly approached him, her dark eyes holding his with that same unsettling intelligence he had noticed earlier. She moved to the skull and pawed at the sand beside it, revealing more bones, a rib cage, the curve of a spine, the scattered remnants of what had once been a living person. Jack knelt despite his revulsion, his hands shaking slightly as he brushed away more sand, uncovering evidence of a violent death. The skull showed a clean hole in the back, the unmistakable mark of a bullet fired at close range. He sat back on his heels, his mind racing through implications he did not want to face. Samuel Brennan had hired him to work a ranch in these mountains, had paid him half his wages in advance with the promise of more when the job was complete. But what if the job was not what Brennan had claimed? What if Jack was not being hired to drive cattle, but to become another pile of bones in this hidden valley, another secret buried where no one would ever find it? The gunshots he had heard earlier took on new meaning. 3 shots, pause, 3 more. A signal, yes, but perhaps also a warning. Someone knew he was coming, had been watching his progress across the desert, and those shots had been meant to tell him something. Turn back, danger ahead. Danger, death waiting in the mountains. But the Foals had not led him away from danger. They had brought him to this place deliberately, shown him the bones, the artifacts, the evidence of crimes committed in darkness and hidden from justice. They wanted him to know, to understand, to make a choice about what came next. He could leave now, ride back to Tucson, and forget about Samuel Brennan and his mysterious ranch. Or he could continue forward, armed with knowledge that might be the only thing standing between him and a shallow grave. Jack stood and walked back to Copper. His decision already made, though he had not consciously formed it. He had spent too many years drifting, taking jobs that asked nothing of him beyond his labor, avoiding connections that might lead to the kind of pain he had felt when his parents died. But these Foals, impossible as they were, had chosen him for something, had trusted him with their strange purpose, and he would not betray that trust by running away. He gathered the artifacts, wrapping them carefully in his bedroll. Evidence if he survived long enough to present it to someone who cared about justice in this lawless territory. The skull he left where it lay, a silent witness to whatever tragedy had unfolded in this hidden valley. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the cliff walls in shades of gold and red, Jack made camp by the spring. The desert night came quickly, as it always did, the temperature plummeting from scorching to frigid in the space of an hour. Jack built a small fire using dead wood he found scattered around the cottonwoods, keeping the flames low to avoid attracting unwanted attention. The 7 foals had settled near the spring, lying in a tight circle with their heads facing outward like sentries guarding against the darkness. He had never seen horses arrange themselves that way, and it reinforced his growing certainty that these creatures were something more than ordinary animals. As he ate a meager dinner of hardtack and jerky, Jack studied the artifacts he had collected, laying them out on his bedroll in the firelight. Each piece told part of a story he was only beginning to understand. The saddle had been made in 1851 according to the maker's mark, which meant it was over 20 years old. The silver conchos bore initials he could barely make out in the flickering light, but they looked like JB, which could stand for any number of names or might mean nothing at all. The belt buckle was more revealing. On its back, someone had engraved a date, June 15th, 1868, 7 years ago, almost to the month. Jack did the mathematics in his head, calculating how long bones would take to bleach white in the desert sun. How many seasons of rain and wind and heat would be needed to strip flesh from skeleton and scatter the remains across sandy ground? 7 years seemed about right, which meant whoever had died in this valley had been killed in the summer of 1868. He pulled out the crumpled envelope on which Samuel Brennan had drawn his map, studying it in the firelight. The ranch was marked with an X in the Tortolita Mountains, with a note indicating it had been in the Brennan family since 1851. The same year the saddle had been made. Too many coincidences. Too many connections between the man who had hired him and the bones lying 50 feet away. A sound made Jack look up sharply, his hand moving to his revolver. The lead filly had risen from her resting place and was walking toward him, her white coat seeming to glow in the darkness. She approached without fear, coming close enough that he could feel the warmth of her breath on his face. Up close, her eyes were even more remarkable, dark and deep as mountain pools, holding wisdom that should not exist in such a young creature. She lowered her head and nuzzled the artifacts spread before him, touching each one with her soft muzzle. When she reached the belt buckle, she paused, standing perfectly still for a long moment. Then she did something that made Jack's blood run cold. She pawed the ground 3 times, paused, then 3 times more. The same pattern as the gunshots he had heard earlier. 3 paws, 3. Jack stared at her, his mind rejecting what his eyes were seeing. Horses did not communicate in code. They did not understand human concepts like warning signals or deliberate patterns. Yet this filly had just reproduced the exact sequence he had heard echoing across the desert, and she had done it while touching the belt buckle engraved with a date 7 years past. "Who are you?" he whispered, though he knew she could not answer, not with words anyway. "What are you trying to tell me?" The filly raised her head and looked toward the canyon entrance, her ears pricked forward in alert attention. The other 6 foals rose as one, forming their defensive circle again, and Jack felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Something was out there in the darkness, something the foals had sensed before he could hear or see it. He doused the fire with sand, plunging the valley into darkness broken only by starlight. His eyes adjusted slowly, and he moved to where Copper stood hobbled near the spring, placing a calming hand on her neck. The mare was nervous, shifting her weight and blowing softly through her nostrils, but she did not panic. The 7 foals remained motionless, their white forms barely visible against the darker ground. Then Jack heard it, the faint sound of hoofbeats echoing through the canyon. Someone was coming, navigating the narrow passage in darkness, which meant they knew the way well enough to travel it blind or desperate enough to risk it. He drew his revolver and moved to a position behind one of the cottonwoods, his back pressed against rough bark, his breathing controlled and quiet. The hoofbeats grew louder, closer, and Jack could tell it was a single rider on a horse moving at a walk. Cautious, careful, but not trying to hide their approach. When the rider emerged from the canyon mouth, silhouetted against the star-filled sky, Jack saw immediately that it was a woman. She sat her horse with practiced ease, her posture upright despite what must have been a long day of travel, and even in the darkness, he could see she carried a rifle across her saddle. The 7 foals broke their formation and ran to her, surrounding her horse with welcoming nickers that sounded almost like human laughter. The woman dismounted smoothly, and the foals pressed against her, nuzzling her clothes and hair with obvious affection. She spoke to them softly, words Jack could not quite hear, and he realized he was witnessing a reunion, a meeting between these strange white horses and someone they knew and loved. "Stay where you are," the woman called out suddenly, her voice carrying clearly across the valley. "I know you're there, and I know you're armed. But if you mean me or these foals any harm, you won't live long enough to regret it." Jack stepped out from behind the tree, his revolver held loosely at his side, pointing at the ground. "I mean no harm," he said. "The foals led me here. I was just following them." The woman laughed, a sound without humor. "The foals led you? That's convenient. Samuel Brennan hired you, did he not? Paid you good money to come to his ranch and drive cattle?" The fact that she knew about his arrangement with Brennan told Jack this was no chance encounter. She had been expecting him, or someone like him, and the foals had been part of her plan. "How do you know about Brennan?" he asked. "'Cause he killed my father 7 years ago in this very valley," she replied, her voice steady but edged with old pain. "Shot him in the back of the head and left him to rot like an animal, and now he's trying to finish what he started by luring men here to die, so there are no witnesses to his crimes." Jack felt the pieces clicking into place, the puzzle solving itself with terrible clarity. The bones, the artifacts, the date on the belt buckle. This woman's father had been murdered here, and Samuel Brennan was the killer. The Foals had brought him to this valley not to trap him, but to warn him, to show him what awaited if he continued to the ranch. "Why did he kill your father?" Jack asked. "For land," she said simply. "For water rights and grazing territory and all the things men murder each other over in this God-forsaken country. My father owned the ranch Brennan claims is his. When he would not sell, Brennan invited him here to discuss a compromise. My father came alone because he trusted people too easily. He believed in talking things through, finding peaceful solutions." The woman moved closer to the remains of Jack's fire, and in the starlight, he could make out more details. She was perhaps 30 years old, with long dark hair braided down her back and features that spoke of mixed heritage, Apache and white if he had to guess. She wore men's clothing, practical trail gear that had seen hard use, and she handled her rifle with the confidence of someone who knew how to use it and had done so before. "My name is Elena Vasquez," she said, kneeling to relight the fire with practiced efficiency. "My father was Jonathan Brennan, brother to Samuel Brennan. They owned the ranch together, inherited it from their father, who built it from nothing in the 1830s. When their father died in 1865, Samuel wanted to expand, to take over more land, to build an empire. My father wanted to maintain what they had, to live simply and honestly. They argued for years, but my father never thought Samuel would actually kill him over their differences." Jack holstered his revolver and sat across the fire from her, watching as flames caught and grew, pushing back the darkness. The 7 Foals had settled around Elena like white guardians, their presence clearly protective. "And you've been waiting for 7 years to prove what he did?" Elena shook her head. "I've been waiting for 7 years to survive long enough to prove it. After my father disappeared, Samuel claimed the ranch as sole owner. He said my father had sold his share and moved to California. When I challenged him, when I demanded to see proof of this sale, Samuel tried to have me killed." She pulled back her sleeve, revealing a long scar that ran from wrist to elbow. "His men caught me on the road to Tucson. They thought they had finished the job, but I survived. Spent 6 months recovering with my mother's people in the mountains, learning to be harder than I had ever needed to be." "What about the law?" Jack asked. "The territorial marshal, the sheriff?" Elena's laugh was bitter. "Samuel Brennan owns the sheriff, pays him well to look the other way when inconvenient questions arise. As for the marshal, he needs evidence, not the accusations of a half-breed woman against one of the richest ranchers in the territory. Without proof, without my father's body, there is nothing anyone can do legally." Jack gestured to the bones scattered near the spring. "You have his body now. You have proof." "Do I?" She looked at the remains with eyes that held old grief barely contained. "I have bones that could belong to anyone. I have artifacts that prove nothing except that someone died here. Samuel will claim it was a drifter, an outlaw, anyone but his own brother. Without witnesses to the murder, without a confession, these bones are just more desert casualties that no one will care about." The lead filly moved to Elena's side, resting her head on the woman's shoulder in a gesture of such obvious affection that Jack felt something tighten in his chest. The other foals pressed closer, forming a protective barrier around her, and he understood that whatever else these creatures might be, they loved this woman with a loyalty that transcended the normal bonds between humans and horses. "Tell me about the foals," he said quietly. "Tell me what they really are." Elena was silent for a long moment, her hand stroking the filly's white neck with gentle reverence. "They were born the night my father died. 7 foals from 7 different mares, all born within hours of each other, all pure white despite their mothers being bay and sorrel and black. The ranch hands called it a miracle, said it was a sign from God, but I knew better. I knew it was my father trying to tell me something from beyond death, trying to give me the tools I would need to bring his killer to justice. Jack wanted to dismiss her words as grief-induced fantasy, but he had seen too much in the past day to cling to rational explanations. These foals had led him through the desert with purpose and intelligence. They had shown him the hidden valley and the evidence it contained. They had communicated in patterns and warnings that no ordinary horses could comprehend. If they were truly born the night Jonathan Brennan died, if they were somehow connected to his murder, then perhaps Elena's belief was not as far-fetched as it seemed. "How have you kept them hidden for 7 years?" he asked. 7 white horses are not easy to conceal." "I did not keep them hidden," Elena replied. "For the first 3 years they lived on what remained of my father's land, protected by the ranch hands who remained loyal to his memory. But as they grew, as their intelligence became more obvious, people started to talk, said they were cursed, possessed, dangerous. Samuel heard the rumors and sent men to kill them, to eliminate anything that might draw attention to that night 7 years ago. And you ran. We ran." Elena's voice was steady, but Jack heard the exhaustion beneath it, the weariness of years spent fleeing and fighting. "We have been moving ever since, staying ahead of Samuel's hired guns, hiding in places like this where few men venture. The foals have grown strong and smart, and they understand what Samuel took from us. They understand revenge better than most humans I have known. But revenge requires more than understanding," Jack said. "It requires a plan." Elena looked at him across the fire, and he saw calculation in her dark eyes, an assessment of his character and trustworthiness. "That is where you come in, Mr. Mallory. Samuel has hired you to drive cattle from the ranch to Tucson, but there are no cattle. There never were. He hires men like you every few months, men with no families, no ties, no one who will miss them when they disappear. He brings them to the ranch, works them for a few weeks to establish their presence, then arranges accidents. Falls from cliffs, trampled by horses, lost in the desert. The bodies are rarely found, and when they are, it looks like nothing more than the usual dangers of frontier life." Jack felt cold, despite the fire's warmth. "How many men has he killed?" "I have counted at least 12 over the past 7 years, though there may be more." She pulled a small leather journal from her saddlebag and tossed it to him. "I have been tracking every man he hires, every disappearance, building a case that even the corrupt sheriff cannot ignore. But I need one more piece of evidence. I need a witness who survives, who can testify to Samuel's intentions, who can stand in court and tell the truth about what happens on that ranch." "You want me to go there," Jack said, understanding dawning. "You want me to walk into his trap and spring it." "I want you to help me end this," Elena corrected. "The foals brought you to this valley because they sensed something in you, some quality that makes you different from the other men Samuel has hired. They have never led anyone here before. They have never revealed this place to strangers. But they chose you, which means you have the strength and character to do what needs to be done." Jack looked at the 7 white foals, their dark eyes reflecting firelight like mirrors. They watched him with that same unsettling intelligence, waiting for his decision, trusting that he would make the right choice. He thought about the skull with the bullet hole, about the 12 men Elena claimed had died at Samuel Brennan's hands, about the casual evil of a man who would murder his own brother for land and profit. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked finally. Elena stood and walked to where her horse stood drinking from the spring, returning with saddlebags that she opened to reveal maps, documents, and what appeared to be official papers bearing territorial seals. She spread them on the ground between her and Jack, creating a makeshift war room illuminated by firelight and starshine. "These are land deeds," she said, pointing to the oldest documents. "The original grant to my grandfather, Ezekiel Brennan, in 1838. He received 10,000 acres from the Mexican government before the war, back when this was still part of Mexico, and ambitious men could claim empires if they were brave enough or foolish enough to try. Jack studied the faded writing, the ornate signatures, the wax seals that had somehow survived decades of storage. When Ezekiel died, the land passed to his two sons equally. Jonathan and Samuel each owned 5,000 acres, but the most valuable portion, the section with the best water sources and grazing land, was held in common. They had to agree on all decisions regarding that shared property, which gave Samuel a motive, Jack said, seeing where this was leading. If Jonathan was gone, Samuel could claim full ownership. Exactly. Elena pulled out another document, this one more recent. This is the deed Samuel filed with the territorial office 6 months after my father disappeared. It shows him as sole owner of all 10,000 acres, claiming my father sold his share before leaving for California. But look at the signature. Jack examined it carefully in the firelight. The handwriting was shaky, uncertain, nothing like the bold, confident script on the earlier documents bearing Jonathan Brennan's name. "This is forged," he said with certainty. "Yes, but proving it is another matter. Samuel has friends in the territorial office, men who benefit from his generosity and turn blind eyes to irregularities. I need more than a questionable signature. I need proof of murder, proof of intent, proof that will force even corrupt officials to act. And you think I can get you that proof?" Elena nodded slowly. "Tomorrow is September 28th. 7 years ago tomorrow, my father rode into these mountains to meet with Samuel. He told me he would be back by sunrise, that they were going to work things out peacefully." She paused, her voice catching slightly. "I waited on the porch of our house, watching the eastern sky, believing he would keep his promise. But sunrise came and went, and he never returned." Jack saw moisture gleaming in her eyes, quickly blinked away. She had lived with this grief for 7 years, had built her life around avenging her father's death. And now she was finally close to the justice she had sought for so long. "What happens tomorrow?" he asked. "Tomorrow you ride to Samuel's ranch as planned. You present yourself as the hired hand he expects, ready to work. The Foals will follow at a distance, watching, waiting. Samuel will treat you well at first, establish witnesses who can testify that you arrived safely. He will assign you tasks, show you the property, make everything appear legitimate. And then, probably within 3 days, he will arrange your accident. It might be a fall from a cliff while checking fence lines. It might be a horse that throws you in a remote canyon. It might be a rattlesnake that appears in your bedroll. Samuel has become creative over the years, learned from each killing how to make the next one look more convincing." "You want me to let him try to kill me," Jack said flatly. "I want you to gather evidence before he succeeds." Elena's eyes held his across the fire. "You will carry a journal, like the one I have been keeping. You will document everything Samuel says and does. You will note the presence of his foreman, a man named Garrett Cole, who does the actual killing. You will create a record that, combined with my testimony and the evidence in this valley, will be enough to hang Samuel Brennan for murder. And if something goes wrong, if Cole is faster than I expect, or if Samuel decides not to wait 3 days, then the Foals will know and they will come for you." Elena placed her hand on the lead filly's neck. "They have abilities I cannot fully explain. They sense danger before it arrives. They know when violence is imminent. They have saved my life more times than I can count over these 7 years. If you are in mortal peril, they will intervene." Jack wanted to ask how 7 young horses could possibly intervene against armed killers, but he had already seen enough to know these creatures operated beyond normal understanding. Instead, he asked the question that had been troubling him since Elena arrived. "Why me? Why not hire your own man, someone you trust, instead of depending on whoever Brennan happens to recruit? Because the Foals chose you, she said simply. I have been watching Samuel's hiring patterns for months, waiting for someone the Foals would accept. They tested 4 men before you, following each one through the desert, observing, judging. Each time they turned away, refusing to reveal themselves. But with you, they showed themselves immediately. They led you here without hesitation. That tells me you are different from the others, that you have qualities Samuel did not anticipate when he placed his advertisement in Tucson. Jack thought about his long ride through the desert, the moment when he first heard the Foals nickering, the choice he had made to follow them rather than continue to the ranch. Perhaps Elena was right. Perhaps there had been something in him that the Foals recognized, some spark of decency or courage he had not known he possessed. I have been alone for a long time, he said quietly. I have avoided connections, avoided causes, avoided anything that might require me to care about outcomes beyond my own survival. After my parents died, it seemed safer not to invest in people or places that could be taken away. And now, Elena asked, now I find myself sitting in a hidden valley with a woman seeking justice for her murdered father and 7 impossible horses who apparently believe I am worth their trust. Jack smiled without humor. It seems safety is no longer an option. Elena reached across the fire, her hand extended. So you will help me? Jack took her hand, feeling the calluses that matched his own, the strength that came from years of hard living. I will help you. But I want your promise that if something happens to me, if Brennan succeeds where others have failed, you will take the evidence to the territorial marshal yourself. No more waiting, no more watching from shadows. You will finish this. You have my word, she said, and the firmness in her voice told him she meant it. They talked long into the night, planning every detail of the coming days. Elena knew Samuel's ranch intimately, having grown up there before her father's death. She drew maps in the sand showing the layout of buildings, the locations of workers' quarters, the remote areas where accidents most often occurred. Jack memorized it all, storing information that might mean the difference between life and death. Jack left the hidden valley at dawn, the 7 white foals following at a distance of roughly a quarter mile, visible only as ghostly shapes moving through the mesquite and creosote. Elena had returned to her own camp deeper in the mountains, taking with her the artifacts and documents they would need if Jack survived long enough to bring Samuel Brennan to justice. The plan was simple in theory but terrifying in practice. Jack would present himself at the ranch, work as hired, and document everything while waiting for Samuel to reveal his murderous intentions. The journal Elena had given him rested in his saddlebag, a small leather-bound book with blank pages waiting to be filled with evidence. She had instructed him to write in code using initials and vague descriptions that would mean nothing to casual observers, but could be deciphered later with her help. If Samuel or his men searched Jack's belongings, they would find what appeared to be mundane observations about weather and work, not accusations of murder. The land changed as he rode, the scrub desert giving way to grassland that spoke of better water sources and richer soil. He could see why men would kill for this territory, why Samuel Brennan had been willing to murder his own brother to claim it wholly. This was prime grazing land, the kind that could support thousands of head of cattle and make a man wealthy beyond the dreams of ordinary ranchers scratching out livings on marginal properties. The ranch house appeared in the distance just before noon, a substantial adobe structure with a red tile roof and a wide veranda that wrapped around 3 sides. Outbuildings spread out behind it, barns and corrals and workers' quarters that indicated a prosperous operation. Jack counted at least a dozen horses in the nearest corral and saw several men working near the barns, their movements efficient and purposeful. This was no struggling enterprise barely surviving in harsh country. This was wealth built on blood and maintained through violence. He reined in Copper at the main gate, waiting for someone to acknowledge his presence. A dog barked from the veranda, and a man emerged from the house, tall and lean with silver hair that caught the sunlight. Even from 50 yards away, Jack could see the family resemblance between this man and the woman he had met last night. Same bone structure, same way of moving, though where Elena carried herself with cautious alertness, this man radiated confidence bordering on arrogance. Samuel Brennan raised a hand in greeting and walked toward Jack with the easy stride of someone who owned everything he surveyed and expected no challenge to that ownership. "You must be Mallory," he called out. "Good timing. I was beginning to think you had gotten lost in the desert." Jack dismounted, extending his hand for the traditional greeting between men on the frontier. The ride took longer than I expected. Rough country between here and Tucson. Samuel's grip was firm, his palm dry despite the heat. "That it is. But you made it, and that is what matters. Come, let me show you around, get you settled before we discuss the work." Jack followed Samuel into the compound, noting everything with the careful attention Elena had insisted upon. The house was well maintained, almost luxurious by frontier standards. Through open windows he glimpsed furniture that must have been shipped from back east at considerable expense, rugs that spoke of wealth and taste, paintings on walls where most ranchers hung only functional items like calendars and ropes. "This is quite an operation," Jack said, keeping his voice neutral and admiring. "My father started it with nothing but determination and a Mexican land grant," Samuel replied, and there was pride in his voice but also something darker that Jack could not quite identify. "My brother and I built it into what you see today, though I have shouldered most of the burden in recent years." The lie came so smoothly, delivered with such casual conviction, that Jack felt a chill run down his spine. This was a man who had rewritten history to suit his needs, who believed his own fabrications so completely that he could speak them without hesitation or guilt. Jonathan had not helped build this ranch in recent years, because Jonathan had been dead for 7 of them, his bones bleaching in a hidden valley while his killer claimed credit for their shared work. Samuel showed Jack the barns first, pointing out the quality of the horses and the careful organization of tack and tools. Everything was clean and orderly, maintained with a discipline that suggested either a demanding owner or workers who feared the consequences of sloppiness. Jack suspected the latter when he saw how the ranch hands averted their eyes as Samuel passed, how they found sudden urgent tasks that required their attention elsewhere. In the third barn, Jack met Garrett Cole, the foreman Elena had warned him about. Cole was shorter than Jack had expected, perhaps 5'8", but built like a oak stump with shoulders that strained the seams of his shirt and hands that looked capable of crushing stone. His eyes were pale blue, almost colorless, and they assessed Jack with the cold calculation of a predator evaluating potential prey. "This is our new hand," Samuel said to Cole, "Jack Mallory. Get him set up in the bunkhouse and show him the north pasture. We will start him on fence repair tomorrow." Cole nodded without speaking, his gaze never leaving Jack's face. There was intelligence behind those pale eyes, cunning and cruelty combined in equal measure. This was Samuel's executioner, the man who did the actual killing while his boss maintained plausible deniability. Elena had been right to fear him. The bunkhouse was spartanly furnished but clean, with a dozen cots arranged along the walls and a potbelly stove in the center for winter heating. Only 3 of the cots showed signs of current occupation, which seemed odd for a ranch this size. Jack chose a bed near the door, positioning himself where he could see anyone entering or leaving. Cole watched him unpack his meager belongings with those unsettling pale eyes, and Jack made certain the journal remained hidden at the bottom of his saddlebag. "You come alone?" Cole asked, his voice surprisingly soft for a man his size. "Just me and my horse," Jack replied. "Why?" "Most men bring more," Cole said. "Extra gear, personal items, things that suggest they plan to stay a while." You travel light for someone taking a permanent position. I have learned not to get attached to possessions, Jack said, meeting Cole's gaze steadily. The desert has a way of taking everything you own if you are not careful. Something that might have been amusement flickered across Cole's face. That it does, Mr. Mallory. That it does. That first night at the ranch, Jack lay awake on his cot listening to the sounds of men sleeping around him. The other 3 workers in the bunkhouse were Mexican hands who spoke little English and kept to themselves, with the wariness of men who had learned that curiosity could be dangerous. When Jack had introduced himself at dinner, they had nodded politely but offered no names in return, no stories about where they came from or how long they had worked for Samuel Brennan. That silence told him everything he needed to know about the atmosphere of fear that permeated this place. After the others had fallen asleep, Jack retrieved the journal from his saddlebag and wrote his first entry by the light of a small candle. He kept his words vague and coded as Elena had instructed, but he recorded the essential details. The date, his arrival time, the names of Samuel Brennan and Garrett Cole, the number of workers he had counted, the layout of the ranch buildings. Facts that would mean nothing to anyone reading casually, but could be assembled into evidence of systematic murder when combined with Elena's documentation. He noted Samuel's easy lies about his brother, the way Cole had assessed him like a butcher examining livestock, the fear he sensed in the Mexican workers. All of it went into the journal in careful handwriting, each word potentially the difference between justice and another unmarked grave in the desert. When he finished, he hid the book in a crack between wall boards behind his cot, a place where casual searchers would not find it, but where he could access it quickly when needed. The second day began before dawn, with Cole pounding on the bunkhouse door and shouting for everyone to rise. Jack dressed quickly and followed the others to the main house, where breakfast was served in a long dining room that seemed designed to impress rather than comfort. Samuel sat at the head of the table, eating eggs and steak while discussing the day's work assignments. He was all frontier hospitality and good humor, playing the role of benevolent employer with practiced ease. "Mallory, you will ride with Cole today to inspect the north fence line," Samuel said between bites of steak. "Some sections need repair before winter, and I want to know the extent of the damage. Take supplies for 2 days. The territory up there is rough, and you will need to camp overnight." Jack felt his pulse quicken, but kept his expression neutral. 2 days alone with Garrett Cole in remote country was exactly the kind of situation Elena had warned about. This was how Samuel worked, separating his victims from witnesses, creating opportunities for accidents that no one could question. "Are we expecting trouble with the fence?" Jack asked casually. "Cattle break through sometimes, especially the bulls." Samuel smiled, but the expression did not reach his eyes. "We lost 3 good steers last month to breaks in the north section. Cost me money I could not afford to lose." Another lie delivered with absolute conviction. This ranch was clearly profitable, and the loss of 3 steers would barely register in its books. But Samuel wanted to establish a reason for Jack to be in dangerous territory, a legitimate excuse for why a new hire might fall to his death or disappear into a canyon where his body would never be found. Cole was waiting by the barn with 2 horses already saddled and loaded with supplies. He had chosen a mean-looking bay gelding for Jack, a horse with wild eyes and laid-back ears that suggested a difficult temperament. Jack approached carefully, letting the horse smell his hand before attempting to mount. The gelding danced sideways, testing him, but Jack had handled worse and settled into the saddle with firm confidence. They rode north in silence, Cole leading the way through increasingly rough terrain. The grassland gave way to rocky hills cut by deep arroyos where flash floods had carved channels through stone over countless centuries. It was beautiful country, but deadly, the kind of place where a man could fall and lie undiscovered until scavengers scattered his bones across miles of wilderness. Jack kept his eyes on the surrounding landscape, looking for the white shapes of the 7 foals. He saw nothing, but he felt their presence somehow. A sense of being watched that was not threatening but reassuring. Elena had promised they would follow, that they would intervene if his life was in immediate danger, and he chose to believe her, despite the rational part of his mind that insisted horses could not possibly fulfill such promises. By noon they had reached the fence line Samuel had mentioned. Cole dismounted and began examining posts and wire with exaggerated care, pointing out breaks that looked suspiciously fresh, as if they had been cut recently rather than damaged by cattle. "This is worse than I thought," Cole said, his soft voice carrying an undercurrent of something Jack could not quite identify. "We will need to replace at least 20 posts, maybe more. Could take us 3 or 4 days to finish the job properly. 3 or 4 days alone with a killer in remote country." Jack felt sweat that had nothing to do with the heat trickle down his spine. "I thought we brought supplies for 2 days," he said carefully. "We can hunt for food if needed," Cole replied, and his pale eyes met Jack's with flat emptiness that confirmed every suspicion. A man can survive a long time out here if he knows what he is doing. The threat was unmistakable, delivered with casual menace that spoke of experience with this kind of psychological warfare. Cole was testing him, watching for signs of fear or awareness, trying to determine if Jack suspected what was coming. Jack kept his face neutral, his body language relaxed, giving nothing away despite the adrenaline flooding his system. They worked through the afternoon, replacing posts and restringing wire in silence, broken only by necessary communication about tools and technique. Cole moved with efficient brutality, driving posts into hard ground with powerful strikes that left no doubt about his physical strength. Jack matched his pace, determined not to show weakness or fatigue that might trigger Cole's instincts to strike. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Cole announced they would make camp in a canyon a mile to the east. "It has water and shelter," he said. "Good place to spend the night." Jack followed him into the canyon, every sense alert for danger. The walls rose high on both sides, cutting off easy escape routes, and the narrow entrance would be simple to guard. This was an ambush site, chosen specifically for its tactical advantages. Cole would make his move tonight or tomorrow, probably while Jack slept, or when he was distracted by some task that required him to turn his back. They made camp near a small spring that bubbled up between rocks at the canyon's far end. Cole built a fire while Jack tended the horses, hobbling them where they could graze on sparse grass growing near the water. As he worked, he caught a glimpse of white on the canyon rim high above, just a flash of movement that could have been bird or cloud, but felt like something more. Cole prepared dinner with the same efficient brutality he brought to every task, slicing salt pork and dropping it into a pan over the fire with movements that seemed deliberately menacing. Jack sat on the opposite side of the flames, his back against a boulder that prevented anyone from approaching unseen from behind. He had positioned himself carefully, maintaining sight lines to both the canyon entrance and the narrow passage that led deeper into the rocks. If Cole intended to kill him tonight, the man would have to do it face to face. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackle of burning wood and the occasional snort from the hobbled horses. When the meal was finished, Cole pulled out a bottle of whiskey from his saddlebag and offered it to Jack. "Drink?" he asked, his pale eyes reflecting firelight like a predator's. Jack shook his head. "Prefer to keep a clear head when I am working in unfamiliar country. Man never knows when he might need his wits about him." Something that might have been respect flickered across Cole's face. "Smart. I have seen too many men die out here because they dulled their senses with drink when they should have been paying attention." He took a long pull from the bottle himself, then corked it and set it aside. "Of course, sometimes a man drinks because he knows what is coming and wants the edge taken off." The words hung between them, loaded with meaning. This was Cole's way of announcing his intentions, giving Jack a chance to understand what would happen before it began. There was a strange honor in it, a frontier code that demanded enemies acknowledge each other before violence commenced. "Samuel sends his regards," Cole said quietly. Says to tell you he appreciates your service." Brief as it was. Jack's hand moved toward his revolver, but Cole was already drawing, his movement smooth and practiced. The shot echoed off the canyon walls like thunder, and Jack felt the bullet pass close enough to his ear that he heard its whisper. He rolled sideways, coming up behind the boulder with his own gun drawn, returning fire blindly toward where Cole had been standing. But Cole had moved too, disappearing into shadows beyond the firelight with the skill of someone who had ambushed men before. Jack heard footsteps on stone, the soft scrape of boots finding purchase on rock, and he realized Cole was circling around to flank him. The canyon that had seemed like shelter now revealed itself as a trap, its walls closing in to limit his options. Another shot rang out, this one striking the boulder inches from Jack's head and sending stone fragments into his face. He felt blood on his cheek but ignored it, focusing on the muzzle flash that had revealed Cole's position. He fired 3 times in rapid succession, aiming not at where Cole was but where he would need to move to maintain his advantage. The third shot produced a grunt of pain and a clatter of metal on stone. Jack had hit something, whether flesh or weapon he could not tell, but Cole's breathing changed, became labored and angry. "You are better than the others," the foreman called out from darkness. "Most of them died without even drawing their guns. You might actually make this interesting." Jack did not respond, refusing to give away his position with words. Instead, he moved silently along the canyon wall, using shadows and rock formations for cover. He was acutely aware that he had perhaps 4 bullets left in his revolver, while Cole likely had a rifle in addition to his handgun. This was a losing fight, unless something changed, unless the mysterious help Elena had promised materialized before Cole's superior firepower overwhelmed him. Then he heard it, the sound that made his heart leap with desperate hope. Hoofbeats, multiple sets, coming fast through the canyon entrance. The 7 white foals burst into the firelight like avenging angels, their coats luminous in the flames, their eyes burning with intelligence and purpose. They did not scatter or panic as normal horses would have in the presence of gunfire. Instead, they formed a line between Jack and where Cole had taken cover, creating a living barrier that no bullet could penetrate without killing them first. Cole emerged from shadows, his rifle raised, his face twisted with confusion and rage. "What is this? What kind of trick are you playing, Mallory?" "No trick," Jack replied, standing up from his cover with his revolver trained on Cole's chest. "Just justice that has been 7 years coming." The foals moved then, advancing on Cole with slow, deliberate steps that spoke of coordinated intent. The lead filly pawed the ground 3 times, paused, then 3 more, the same signal Jack had seen her give in the hidden valley. Cole's eyes widened with something that might have been recognition or fear, and he backed away until the canyon wall stopped his retreat. "I know what you are," Cole whispered, staring at the white horses. Old Maria in the bunkhouse used to tell stories about ghost horses that appeared when blood debts needed settling. Said they were spirits of murdered men seeking revenge. I thought she was just a crazy old woman. Maria was right, a new voice said from the canyon entrance. Elena rode into the firelight on her own horse, her rifle leveled at Cole with rock-steady hands. "These are the spirits of my father and the 12 men your employer murdered. They have led us to you, Garrett Cole, and now you will answer for your crimes." Behind Elena came 4 more riders, men wearing the silver stars of territorial marshals. They fanned out across the canyon, surrounding Cole with professional efficiency. Jack recognized the lead marshal from wanted posters he had seen in Tucson, a legendary lawman named Thomas Ward, who had built a reputation for pursuing justice into the most remote corners of the territory. "Garrett Cole," Ward said in a voice that carried absolute authority, "you are under arrest for the murders of Jonathan Brennan and at least 12 other men. Drop your weapons." Cole looked around at the marshals, at Elena, at Jack, and finally at the 7 white foals who stood watching him with eyes that seemed to see into his very soul. His shoulders sagged in defeat, and he let the rifle fall from his hands. When the marshals moved forward to shackle him, he did not resist. Samuel Brennan was arrested at sunrise, pulled from his bed in the luxurious ranch house by Marshal Ward and his deputies, while ranch hands watched in stunned silence. The man who had ruled this corner of Arizona territory with fear and violence for 7 years was shackled like a common criminal, his protests of innocence falling on ears that had heard too many lies to be swayed by more. Elena stood on the veranda as they led him away, her face showing no triumph, only the exhausted relief of someone who had carried an impossible burden for far too long. Jack sat with the 7 white foals near the corral as the sun climbed above the eastern mountains, painting the desert in shades of gold and red that seemed almost sacred in their beauty. The horses had settled around him in their familiar protective circle, and he found himself running his hands through their silken manes, marveling at creatures that defied every natural law he understood. They had saved his life, intervened at the exact moment when Cole's bullets would have ended his story in an unmarked canyon grave. Elena approached slowly, 2 tin cups of coffee in her hands. She offered one to Jack and sat beside him on the ground, her shoulder touching his in comfortable companionship. The foals made room for her, the lead filly resting her head in Elena's lap with obvious affection. For a long time they sat in silence, watching the sunrise and feeling the weight of 7 years of pursuit finally lifting. "The marshals found my father's remains in the hidden valley," Elena said quietly. "They have confirmed the identity through his personal effects and the bullet hole in his skull. Combined with Cole's confession and the evidence in your journal, they have more than enough to convict Samuel of murder. He will hang before winter." Jack nodded, thinking about the artifacts scattered in that secret place, the bones that had waited so long for discovery. And the other men, the 12 Cole killed on Samuel's orders. Ward is organizing search parties to recover what can be found. Most of the bodies will never be located, lost to the desert and time, but their families will at least have answers now. Elena's voice caught slightly. "That is something. More than I dared hope for when this began." The lead filly raised her head suddenly, her dark eyes fixing on the eastern horizon where the sun had just cleared the mountain peaks. The other 6 foals stood as one, forming a line facing the dawn light. Jack felt something change in the air, a subtle shift that made the hair on his arms stand up. The foals began to glow, not with reflected sunlight, but with an inner luminescence that had nothing to do with natural physics. "Elena," Jack whispered, "what is happening?" She smiled through tears that streamed down her face. "They are going home. Their purpose is fulfilled, their debt to my father paid. They were never meant to stay in this world forever." As Jack watched in awe, the 7 white foals became translucent, their solid forms shifting into something that existed between material and spirit. He could see through them to the desert beyond, could see their hearts beating with light instead of blood, could see the consciousness that had inhabited these impossible bodies, preparing to depart for realms he could not comprehend. The lead filly approached him one last time, her muzzle soft against his cheek in a gesture of farewell. He understood then why they had chosen him, why they had revealed themselves 3 days ago in the desert heat. He had been lost in solitude and grief, avoiding connection, hiding from the pain of caring. They had needed someone who could still be redeemed, who had enough heart left to risk it for justice and truth. They had seen in him what he had not seen in himself, the potential for courage and sacrifice that had lain dormant since his parents died. "Thank you," he whispered to her. "Thank you for choosing me, for trusting me, for showing me I could still matter." The filly nickered softly, and Jack heard in that sound something that might have been his father's voice telling him to be strong, his mother's laughter reminding him that joy was still possible. the voices of all those who had died too soon encouraging him to live fully while he still could. Then she turned back to her siblings, and together the 7 foals walked into the rising sun. They dissolved slowly, their luminous forms merging with golden light, until Jack could no longer distinguish horse from sunbeam. For a moment he thought he saw 7 human figures standing where the foals had been, translucent and shining, raising their hands in blessing or farewell. Then they were gone completely, leaving only hoofprints in the dust that would fade with the first strong wind. Elena sobbed quietly, her grief for her father finally finding release after 7 years of being held in check by the demands of survival and revenge. Jack put his arm around her shoulders, offering comfort with his presence when words would have been inadequate. They sat together as the ranch came to life around them, as marshals prepared to transport prisoners to Tucson, as workers who had lived in fear began to realize they were finally free. Later that morning, Marshal Ward approached them with documents requiring signatures and statements. The legal process of bringing Samuel Brennan to justice would take months, involving courts and lawyers, and the slow machinery of territorial law. But the outcome was certain, the evidence overwhelming, and Ward promised that both Jack and Elena would see justice served before the year ended. "What will you do now?" Jack asked Elena as they prepared to leave the ranch that had cost her father his life. "Rebuild," she replied, looking out over the land that was rightfully hers. "This ranch belongs to my father's memory, and I will honor that by making it into something good instead of the monument to greed and violence Samuel created." She turned to Jack with a question in her eyes. "I will need help. Someone I can trust. Someone who understands what this place means." Jack thought about the empty years he had spent drifting, the careful isolation he had maintained to protect himself from loss. The 7 white foals had shown him a different path, one that required courage but promised meaning. He looked at Elena, saw strength and hope in her face despite everything she had endured, and made his choice. "I am not going anywhere," he said simply. They rode away from the ranch together as the sun climbed higher, beginning the journey back to Tucson, where they would testify against Samuel Brennan and start the long process of healing. Behind them, the desert wind erased the hoofprints left by 7 impossible horses who had appeared when justice demanded intervention and disappeared when their purpose was complete. Jack Mallory had spent 3 days following Albino Foals through the desert, trusting them to lead him towards something he could not name. At sunrise on the 4th day, he finally understood why. They had not been leading him to a destination, but to a new beginning, not to death, but to a life worth living, not to isolation, but to connection with someone who understood loss and chose hope anyway. The mystery was solved, the murders avenged, and the ghost horses gone. But their legacy remained in 2 people who had been given a second chance to build something meaningful from the ashes of tragedy, and in the justice that would finally be served in a courtroom far from the hidden valley where it had all begun.